Good morning, everyone. Thank you for making the time to attend today's panel, The Islamic State in the Congo. My name is Harindram, and I'm a senior research fellow here at the Program on Extremism. And I'll be moderating what promises to be a really exceptional panel to help launch our most recent publication, The Islamic State in Congo, which was a joint effort between the Program on Extremism and the Bridgeway Foundation. Today's panelists in order of appearance are Tara Candland, who's a project officer with the Bridgeway Foundation, Jason Stearns, the director of the Congo Research Group at NYU, Bilama Bakati, an analyst with the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change in London, and Laren Poole, the chief operations officer for the Bridgeway Foundation. So the plan for today is that we will open with about 10 minutes worth of remarks from our panelists. We'll then have about 10 to 15 minutes of discussion before opening for Q&A. Now, please feel free to send your questions through the chat function whenever you like, and I'll do my best to get through as many of those questions as possible. So let's get straight into it, and thank you all again for your time, and over to you, Tara. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Farrar. Let me share my screen here. So thank you for joining us today to discuss our paper, The Islamic State in Congo. The Islamic State is one name for the Allied Democratic Forces, the ADF. You might also hear them called ISCAP, the Islamic State Central Africa Province. So we'll likely be using all of these names interchangeably today, just so you're aware. I want to start the presentation, though, with a short clip that the ADF, of a longer video that the ADF released in September 2020. In it, Musa Buluku, the leader of the ADF, clarifies who the ADF is now.
ADF teriiwo liri lyali wasiire yali kubo litutuusa kugendererwa kigendero twakituukako ezenella saawa eno tuli mu wilaya namba min wilayati dawlati al-islamiyya tahta khalifati al-muslimin kitegeera bulungi kati nolwekyo tetulina.
So how did the ADF become one of the many ISIS provinces, as Buluku put it? That's the question that our paper seeks to answer. And it's actually whether or not there's been an alliance has been a source of debate and what exactly that alliance looks like. And the issue, some of the history behind the ADF explains why there's a debate around whether or not there's been a debate in the past around whether or not there's an alliance. The ADF is a Ugandan group that started in the 1990s by Jamil Mukulu and a few others, and their original intent was to overthrow the government of Uganda. They were eventually been driven out of Uganda into Eastern Congo, where they aligned with NALU, the National Army for the Liberation of Uganda, another anti-government group, and they settled in. They married with the local community. They lived peaceably for more than a decade with the local communities there. And so when the group started to change, there was a lot of debate over whether or not these were the same people that they had known for the last, many years. But around 2011, the group did start to change. A few years earlier, NALU had demobilized, leaving the ADF alone in the bush. The ADF had always been a Muslim group, but they became increasingly radical and started to attack civilians as well. And so finally, in 2014, FARDC, the Congolese army, went after the group for the first time. And you can see here a graph of ADF violence starting from 2013 going through Q3 of 2020. And this first big spike is revenge killings in response to FARDC offensive in 2014. And then after that, you see that the group kind of settled into what might be considered their normal level of violence before it bottoms out in 2017. Our research shows that around that time, the group was in dire need of money and experiencing extremely low morale. And that's when Buluku turned to ISIS. So at this point, Buluku was the leader of the group. Makulu, the original founder, had been driven out of the bush during the 2014 offensive and had been arrested in Tanzania in 2015. And Buluku was his second in command and much more radical by all reports. And so he turned to ISIS, which Makulu had been against. And as we see, starting in 2017, you can see that the violence starts to increase. And as the relationship between the ADF and the Islamic State grows, their capacity for violence grows, so that their response to the FARDC offensive becomes larger, and their normal level of violence gets a lot higher. So 2017 is when we have the first confirmed links between the ADF and the Islamic State. 2016 is when defectors say that they first started hearing rumors, but 2017, we see connections with a man called Walid Zain, who was an ISIS financier based in Kenya. And he sent money to the ADF using at least 2 known collaborators in Uganda, who then transferred the money over into Congo. And then Zain was arrested in 2018 and sanctioned by the United States for being a financier of the Islamic State in Central Africa and other places. And after that, we see the money start to shift to come from Turkey, from South Africa, and from other ISIS-affiliated groups and cells, sometimes going through Kenya, sometimes going directly up into Uganda, and then transferring over into the bush. And that financing has continued on to today. At the same time, we see a fairly distinct shift in how the ADF is operating as well. Around 2016, 2017, they began posting videos and messages on social media, which you can learn more about from in the report titled Inside the ADF, which was co-written with Jason Stearns. And that was a distinct shift for the group. They were a notoriously secretive group, never showing, never releasing any sort of external media. And then we see this. And the content, the language, everything about these videos seems to imply that they're trying to position themselves for the first time as part of this global jihadist movement. This clip is one of the most notable. In it, you'll see Jundi, who's a Tanzanian speaking Arabic. Remember, this was a almost exclusively Ugandan group, calling on people to come and to join their Islamic State in Central Africa.
إنها معيشة طيبة والله تعالى وإلى إخوانكم هنا في دار الإسلام في دولة إسلامية في وسط أفريقيا هذه دولة الإسلام تعالوا وقاتلوا معنا.
Following those videos that were released in 2016 and 17, the group kind of pulled back and didn't have a really public presence again until 2019, when in April 2019, the Islamic State claimed its first attack in Congo. Since then, in the last 24 months, the group has claimed 110 attacks. They've released 59 photos, 3 videos, some of which are exclusive. You can't find them on any local media. They're exclusive to the Islamic State. In July of 2019, they released a video that shows Buluku reaffirming his pledge of allegiance, the ADF's pledge of allegiance to the Islamic State. And also notably, we get this picture that you can see in the top right, which is Buluku himself inside the camp preaching to the ADF, and his face is unblurred, unmasked, which is the first time that we've seen this kind of public release of a photo of Buluku. So it shows a fair amount of confidence and a pretty strong allegiance between the two groups. This graphic here shows an overlap of the claims, so the 110 attacks that have been claimed by the Islamic State versus known and confirmed ADF attacks. Of the 110 attacks that ISIS has claimed, 66 of them correspond to known ADF attacks, so roughly 60%. The ADF restarted its local media in late 2019, which is something that we see in other ISIS affiliates on the continent as well, that they have this dual track. On the one hand, ISIS has an international media arm that projects the image that they want to project, but then the ADF and others will have a local media arm that's really targeted more towards local audiences. So their videos tend to be in Luganda, Kiswahili, French, Kinyarwanda, and really are calling on either trying to indoctrinate people and or call them to come and fight. And this is one of the two benefits that we've seen the ADF really get from their allegiance to ISIS. The first is money, and the second is the ability to use the ISIS brand to recruit foreign fighters. So here you can see Ashabul Kafi Media, Cave Dwellers Media, is the brand that the ADF usually uses, although not always, to put out their local media. And what's been interesting to watch is both how the videos have increased in sophistication as well as in co-branding over time. So in December 2010, in the top right, you can see the first time that there was co-branding. It was very simple. There's just the Wilaya Central Africa in a very blurry little box in the bottom of the screen. But by September 2020, in the bottom left, you can see there were high definition intros saying Islamic State, Central Africa Wilaya, and there's the flag of ISIS, the banner of Muhammad, features prominently in these videos now, either being carried or as the central point around which people will stop to speak, or else, as in this clip, it's just waving in the corner of the video itself. So we've seen this evolution alongside the sophistication alongside the evolution of their alliance with the Islamic State. So I want to show you what the ADF looks like now in this last clip. This is a video that was released from Medina camp, the main ADF camp, last month. In it, of the 10 or so people that we've been able to identify, 2 are Burundian, 2 are Congolese, one's a Kenyan, one's a Tanzanian, and then there are a handful of Ugandans. So you're seeing an increasing number of these regional foreign fighters who are coming in, who tend to be more indoctrinated, who are really motivated by the cause. And this is part of a longer video, but what I want to show you here at the end is the Islamic State call and response. Dawat al-Islam Bakia. It's an exclusive call and response to the Islamic State, and we've been seeing it showing up more and more in these videos as they've been showing their allegiance to the group. So thank you for listening, and I'll turn it back over to Harara.
Great, thanks Tara. And next we have Jason Stearns. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, hi. So thank you very much for this opportunity. This is, I think, a very interesting report that was released by George Washington and Bridgeway. My role here is, we've done a lot of research on massacres around Beni since 2015, which is when we started our research there first. I think my role in this panel is primarily to try to set in this context of our own research, and in particular, in terms of what kind of policies might come out of this. And so I think that, I think there's an enormous amount of new data this report has has put on the table. I think it's still important to emphasize that there's an enormous amount that we don't know about the situation. And this has been frustrating since the beginning. It says the ADF is still an extremely secretive group. It operates in a way that's unlike many other Islamic jihadi groups around the world in how opaque it is and reluctant it is really to step into the forefront. It's also very difficult at the local level to get a good understanding of what's going on. So let me just sort of highlight some of the things that perhaps we still don't know and that would be helpful in knowing. And so who is doing the killings? Now, this used to be a question when the massacres began in August of 2014. This was a question this was the question. And I think now it's becoming increasingly clear that the ADF is responsible for the vast majority of the killings right now, at least according to the Kivu security tracker data. It's at least 2/3 and probably quite a few more killings than that of the killings around Beni that the ADF is responsible for. And to put that in context, the situation around Beni is by far the most violent in terms of deaths in the DRC. So there's 5.5 million people displaced in the DRC at the moment. There are, I don't have the figures in front of me. I'm sure that Laren or Tara might have them in front of them. But of the deaths in the Eastern DRC, a vast majority of them are in the territory of Beni, and a vast majority of those, we believe, can be attributed to the ADF. So it's a very important actor in the armed conflict of the Eastern DRC. And yet, when the presentation as was given by Tara puts a big emphasis on the ADF joining the Islamic State in terms of understanding its trajectory, in terms of the killings. But there's another way of presenting this, and I think it's equally important, which is that the real trigger for violence that we've seen in the Eastern Congo has been due to military operations against the ADF. And so we can see this actually throughout the history of the ADF, going back prior even to this spate of massacres. They've been in the Eastern DRC since 1995. There have been numerous offensives against the ADF. And so one way of understanding their killings is that they are increasingly violent because of trying to communicate their adherence to the Islamic State and some of the brutal tactics involved, because perhaps of their policies, as was outlined in the report, against infidels. But another way of understanding this is that it has nothing to do with ideology, but it's purely tactical. That has been the case with the ADF before they took this Islamist bent. And so it's a possibility that that could still be the case. In other words, that they're killing people as a way to distract the Congolese government and army in particular from them, from stretching the Congolese government's operations over a very large area, delegitimizing the Congolese government, showing that it can't protect its own civilians, and retaliating against civilians for providing information on the ADF. And so typical military tactical stuff that actually would have very little, or if anything at all, to do with the ideological, religious nature of the ADF. And I think that's important to bear in mind. It's also important to bear in mind that at least back when we initially started research in 2016, 2017, sorry, 2015 to 2017, where we're doing a lot of research on the ground, we're no longer doing that sort of in-depth research on the ground. A lot of the violence was not due to the ADF, but due to other armed groups as well. So the ADF was a main actor, probably the most important actor, but many other armed groups locally participated in this. When the Congolese army started to launch its large offensive against the ADF in 2014, end of 2013, beginning 2014, the Sokola 1 offensive, what it did is it really shook up local power structures and power balances. And so you had networks linked to the former armed rebellion of the RCD-KML. You had local ethnic minorities, the Mvuba or Pakombe communities that had long felt marginalized against the majority Nande community, who all participated to one degree or the other in the violence. And many of these networks are linked. So the ADF has been there since 1995, and they have relationships with many of these networks. They've recruited amongst them or used them for their supply chains. And so all of these were sort of, in one way or the other, linked to broader power struggles and power dynamics, but also rooted in intensely local politics and politics around land conflicts and customary conflicts and resources. And so cocoa smuggling, for example, timber felling, these sorts of things are very important as well in the terms of the economy, the local war economy. So why do I say this? Why does this matter? This matters because I'm wary that if we portray the ADF as a foreign Islamist armed group and they're motivated by that adherence, it could lead us to a strategy, a heavily militarized strategy against the ADF. And if there's one thing we know about violence around Beni, it's that it's highly correlated with military operations. In other words, you launch a military operation against the ADF, it's very likely you're going to see large-scale massacres against the civilian population. And so I think it's very important to understand how to approach the ADF problem in its entirety. That's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say is that seeing the ADF, and I'm not contesting the fact that it's a terrorist organization or that it's linked to the Islamic State, but seeing the ADF as purely this sort of creature with and pushing a military approach to the ADF could also bolster the Congolese government, which I think is one of the most important actors in this conflict in their passivity and in their negligence more than anything else. As we've seen in terrorist operations elsewhere in the world, if foreign outside military backing comes in, it can render the local government less accountable to its own population. It can bolster it financially, it can legitimize it. And I think that could be dangerous. It could be dangerous in the case of the Congolese government. It could be dangerous in the case of the Ugandan government if they're brought in to be part of the solution as well. And so, again, I think this is a great report that puts a lot of data on the table. I think it's very important to contextualize it and to ask why are the killings happening, who's doing the killing, and then to have a debate around solutions that would prioritize as much as possible nonviolent solutions to the problem around the ADF. So I'll leave it there and pass it on. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you, Jason, for those comments. These are very important points, and we'll be exploring many, if not all of them, during the upcoming discussion. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to Bulama now speaking. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Haroro, and to the program on extremism for inviting me and for this excellent report. I will just do three things. I would start with a few comments on the report itself, look at the broader African or sub-Saharan African landscape, and round up with a few concluding remarks. And the first is to say that I found the report very fascinating, with a clear, demonstrable evidence of the link between ISIS now and the Allied Democratic Forces. And I find the evidence presented in the report very convincing. And I think this report should put to rest the debate as to whether there is a link between ISIS and the Allied Democratic Forces. That's because the evidence presented already is enormous to show that there is the link. And even the nature of the link that was presented in the report very much aligns with the pattern we see in other places in Africa. For example, my major area of study is the Lake Chad region and Sahel. And the pattern of the relationship that has developed since 2018 with the ADF and ISIS is exactly what we saw in Boko Haram when the group pledged allegiance to ISIS in 2015. And I'll just go into about three of them. The first is it starts with this declaration of allegiance and acceptance by the Islamic State. Of course, the relationship may predate that, but we might hardly know because these groups are very secretive. And two, they make it public. We know that that was what happened in the case of ISGS, Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, and also in the case of, there was a pledge of allegiance by the group and then acceptance by ISIS. And what did we see next? The next thing we saw was branding, ISIS branding on their videos and other propaganda materials, but also an upgrade in their technical media expertise, which we later learned in the case of the ISWAP that they got that expertise by ISIS. It was transferred by ISIS mostly through encrypted messaging applications. So then the next thing is how you see ISIS now getting access to exclusive videos and photos and materials from groups where we know they are not on ground. For example, even in the last 3 months, we have seen dozens of claims by ISIS on of ISWAP attacks, and each of those claims would come with exclusive footage of the operation, which demonstrates that there is a communication link between ISIS and ISWAP. And that's exactly what we see in the ADF relationship, in the Central Africa relationship. The upgrade in the messaging expertise has been documented by the report, exclusive footages and photos released by ISIS, the allegiance that was accepted. But the report even goes further to demonstrate some evidence that supports financial support, that shows or indicate financial support by ISIS, which has not been done so far in the case of ISWAP and ISGS which is Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. So what's the point I am making? The point I am making is that I think there is enough evidence in this report to conclude beyond any question that there is a relationship now between ADF and ISIS, and this relationship aligns with the pattern we see across Africa. And I think if we want to go by the conclusion that because there is no evidence of direct operational relationship or direct command and control relationship between ADF and ISIS, if we want to go by that indicator, we might as well conclude that there is no ISIS affiliate or associate in Africa, because none of the groups in sub-Saharan Africa has this direct relationship with ISIS operationally. It is always communication, it is always propaganda, it is always the group saying, we are related, we are part of ISIS, ISIS saying they are a part of us. Now, to my second point, which is around the broader implication. What is the implication of that? And I think the first point is clear. It is the basic point that Africa is now the frontier of jihadism in the world, with the rise of groups like the ADF, but also groups across all parts of Africa, whether it's in Mozambique, in the Sahel, in other places. We have seen groups, some of whom are which are affiliated to ISIS, some to Al-Qaeda, some independent, and these groups continue to rise. And I think the second basic point is the fact that clearly the jihadi threat in Africa is outpacing the response by international partners and domestic governments. And that's why these groups continue to rise. They continue to get deadly and sophisticated, even amidst state efforts and declarations that the groups are being defeated. And I think there are lessons to be learned with that. And perhaps one of it is the fact that the landscape is mainly securitized. The underlying causes are still yet to be addressed properly. And we have got to start this long-term investment into the underlying causes on the ground that push young people to extremism, violence, and criminality. Now, the next point is also around the implication, which is in Central Africa, but also across the continent. What is the relationship? We know that there is no relationship operationally between ISIS Central and these groups, at least as at now, but what is the relationship, the nature of the relationship between the groups themselves in Africa? For example, is there an operational link between ISIS in Congo and ISIS in Mozambique? Or between ISIS in Central Africa and the one in the Sahel, or between the affiliates in the Sahel and the ones in the Lake Chad region? If not, why is ISIS naming these provinces with these broad names? Why is it Central Africa province? Is it some aspirational, operational, geographical conscious they want to, they are pursuing? Why are the groups in the Sahel, the ISIS affiliates in the Sahel and the one in the Lake Chad region all called ISWAP instead of administratively, seen as administratively the same in the ISIS structure? Is that an expression of some kind of aspiration, or is this just a coincidence? And then finally, with the evolution we have seen in the report of ADF, what is the implications for the relationship between groups in, jihadi groups or violent extremist groups in Africa and other non-violent actors on the continent? For example, some would say the ADF started as a nationalist or separatist group. If we want to go by that argument, then what is the implications? For example, we know that ISWAP is making efforts to infiltrate the criminal groups in northwestern Nigeria. We know that jihadi groups in the Sahel are making efforts to infiltrate ethnic militias in the Sahel. What happens to separatist groups in places like Cameroon, for example? Places like, like Congo itself and others in Southern Africa. These are, I think, questions we should be asking ourselves and we should be delving into, And the report did very well by concluding that there is need for more research into this area to understand the nature of this particular relationship, but also the ones I have mentioned, and which recommendations goes hands in hand with the need to invest more into research. I think part of why we are always lagging behind these groups is the fact that not enough investment is made. And so we would keep concluding that there is no link until 3-5 years into the link. And then we start saying, oh, in hindsight, there was this link. That was exactly what happened in Nigeria. When Boko Haram got affiliated to Al-Qaeda, nobody knew until 3-4 years later. But we saw the sophistication in Boko Haram, and then we kept saying they just went underground and resurfaced with bomb-making capacity to make explosives, which was the first in Nigeria and the Lake Chad region. And then we later got evidence that it was through Al-Qaeda that they got those expertise. And so I think there is need for more investment in research. And of course, the final thing I would conclude with, which is my concluding remark, I don't know if I am already running over, but is one thing that hasn't been touched in this report, which I think is important. The report has gone into some details as to what ADF is getting out of this relationship. And many other reports, or several others, have gone into what African groups get from affiliating with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But what I haven't seen in literature in details is what is ISIS getting from the affiliation? What is Al-Qaeda getting from the affiliation? Of course, the obvious answer is, number one, that maybe it is a promotion of the global brand. But we have also seen evidence of how African groups are influencing ISIS, its policy and its practice. And questions, just basic questions like, are the governors of these affiliates in Africa members of ISIS Shura? Are they consulted in ISIS's decision-making structure, or are they just passive recipients? And like I said, for example, in the Lake Chad region, there is evidence that ISWAP has influenced ISIS for policy and practice in on some occasions. And this is something we might go into in the discussion if it interests anyone. But I think there is need for more research into African groups' contribution to the global jihadi movement rather than just the other way around. Thank you very much, Haroro, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Belon, that's fantastic. And so we'll conclude, I guess, the opening session today with Laren. Laren, thank you.
Good morning, thank you. There's already a lot been said, and I'm just going to keep it brief, but Democratic Republic of Congo is second only to Afghanistan in 2020 in terms of non-militant fatalities. That ADF or ISIS and DRC, as Jason said, is really at the forefront of driving that surge in DRC of civilian fatalities, killing over 800 people in 2020 alone and 140 people this year already. And yet the ADF it has killed people just a few days ago in a village in Bulongo in a horrific fashion, causing the local population to riot against the military for a lack of basically lack of security that's being provided. And so it's creating this tipping point. But the ADF has always been a violent armed group. But what we have seen through our research is that while largely the leadership of the ADF has remained intact outside of its former founder, Jamil Makulu, the group was starving for money. And its link to IS is born out of a need for access to external finances. We do not know if their internal illicit networks were able to finance the group after its leader was taken. And it needed regional fighters. The ADF is in an area where it can't easily recruit individuals. It has to abduct or gang press Congolese into its ranks. And what we've seen in the last 4 years is that the ADF has become a regional fighting force. And so it relies heavily on Tanzanians, Burundians, and Ugandans. It's very unique in that scenario in Congo and the armed group ecosystem is that it recruits from capital cities or impoverished areas in the regional countries to supply its rank and file. And it's needed a lot of that. It has been engaged, as Jason said, in a kinetic operation against both the UN Force Intervention Brigade and the Congolese military for the last, 5+ years for the FIB. And, but it has been able to refill its battlefield ranks largely because of this link to IS. The group defectors tell us that money is not an issue anymore. And as Tara showed in the video, we hear that Tanzanians are joining in 2017 in the hundreds, as one defector told us. And so IS in DRC is truly a regional fighting force. It does a lot of the killings, according to defectors, to intimidate the population, as Jason says, or to drive them from their fields so it can gather food. It also has revenge killings that have to do with either politics or business. But the group itself espouses an extreme ideology. And what we are starting to see as of recent this year is that the group has kind of evolved into what seems to be taking a leadership role in ISCAP. And it needs a lot of research and fleshing out, but it is important, I think, that we at least investigate where IS and DRC fits in the ecosystem of ISCAP. What is its role? Is it a rear logistics base for Mozambique? Is it an area where would be jihadis come and train and return to their host country to start their own cells? Or is this a mere evolution of the ADF of convenience and they will go on after this maybe a potential split in IS? We don't know, but what we do know is that the ADF we see today, its capacity for violence that far exceeds anything that we've seen historically from the group. It's horrific, even outside of military operations. Jason was right. The ADF does commit a significant amount of its massacres, what we see during military operations, but its baseline level of violence, even outside of those killings, is very high. And so what we really want to see prioritized, and we're hoping through this research with GW, is that there is non-military responses. We would love the regional actors, the countries that these individuals that are joining IS and DRC would get together, would talk about how to stem recruitment, how to stem finances going into ISIS and DRC, how individuals within the ADF can defect. This is not a monolithic group. A lot of individuals join for various reasons. We find individuals that are tricked. We find individuals that join because they have family links. Obviously, there's a significant amount of disillusionment that happens once people join. There's a real opportunity to chip away at this group through non-kinetic means and stopping the flow of regional foreign fighters and finances, which we think would drastically reduce the group's capacity for violence, which is what I think we all agree on needs to happen. And so we're hoping that this report is just the beginning. It's just the kind of hopefully sets the base for future work. And I really appreciate all the panelists, and Harar, I'll kick it back to you.
Well, thank you, Laren, and thank you to the panelists. I think this has obviously been a really fantastic exchange of ideas, and obviously we want to keep this going. We have a lot of questions that have come in, and so we've got quite a bit to cover in not very much time. So we'll get started. I think that perhaps the obvious place to start, I guess, is with this series of UN Group of Experts reports. The most recent was released in, I think it was December 2020, maybe January, which dismissed the link between the Islamic State and the DRC. And again, this wasn't the first report to dismiss it. This is part of a series of reports that have dismissed the link. And, you know, this is despite Musa Baluku's September 2020 statement and the Islamic State claiming dozens of actions since the previous UN Group of Experts report, which was in earlier in 2020. And as Tara highlighted, the Islamic State Central Media Unit has officially recognized the Baluku-led faction since April 2019, and actually technically November 2018 when you consider the retroactive claim. And so the conclusion which was reached in the report based on that and other evidence was really that the question is not whether there is a relationship between the Islamic State and the ADF faction led by Musa Baluku, but rather what is the nature of that relationship? And that is an extraordinarily complex question, which this report has made an attempt to try to address, to begin the debate and to begin the discourse on this issue. And I have to say, as someone who has spent quite a bit of time working in the Middle East and in Asia, that I share, as I know many of my fellow panelists do, I share the concerns that Jason expressed about, well, what does this actually mean? What does it mean politically? What does it mean strategically in terms of developing solutions, both from the perspective of locals, from the national government, and also obviously from the broader international community? And I hope that these are some of the dynamics that we can discuss over the coming 45 minutes or so. And so let's start with that. Tara, could you perhaps offer your reflections on if not the latest, and certainly the series of group of expert reports, and why perhaps these assessments have been reached, and I guess how you'd respond. I'm interested in everybody's thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up. I think that's a very important question. You know, I should start out by saying we have an enormous amount of respect for the group of experts and all of the work that they do. And, you know, it's very excellent and hard work. Their mandate is broad, and they, you know, try their best to fulfill a very demanding and challenging mandate. One of the things that we lay out in the report is where we get our information, which we have been incredibly lucky in that we have been able to access sources that the group of experts hasn't had access to, whether it's because their mandate really ends at the border with Congo, so they can't track down leads in other countries, or because of you know, some of the complexities of being the UN and operating in Eastern Congo. Sometimes it makes it more difficult to access certain people or certain areas that we've been able to go into and to talk to people. So we've really been able to go beyond the information that has been available to the group of experts, which I think is where you get this divergence of opinion. You know, if the evidence that was available to us is only what is available to the group of experts, I think we would have a lot more doubts. But because of this additional information, talking to many defectors who have come out recently, access to communications and other intelligence, basically, we are very confident in this link in a way that you know, others may not be. And that's what we've tried to present in the report, is we've tried to share this information, this additional information that we've received, so that it's out there and everyone can have access to it and analyze it as well.
Balama, do you have some reflections on this as well? I picked up on a point that you made, which I thought was a really important one, about the 3 to 5 year delay and the implications of that delay, not just for understanding, not just for scholarship, but I mean, and we can even put strategy and policy aside, for the human beings, for the populations that have to withstand this, these kind of horrors. Could you Could you perhaps reflect on, I guess, the implications of that delay from the context that you're focused on?
Sure. Yeah, but I couldn't agree more with Tara that had the group of experts had access to the evidence presented in this report, I would suppose their conclusion would have been different. And I hope with this report, their next report is going to reflect this change. Of course, they said direct link, that they couldn't establish evidence of direct link. I don't know what direct link means. If it is operational, we might say okay, but if it's communication and the usual stuff we have seen, I think there is watertight evidence that there is a link. Now, but I think what this report did differently, in addition to the evidence, is looking at the broader context. You remember in the beginning of the report, you did this excellent work of laying out ISIS's global enterprise and how it evolved over time. And I think if you had, the group of experts had looked at Congo in that broader context, they would have seen exactly what happened in other places and evolved over time, now taking place in Congo. And I think the conclusion would have been different. Now, when it comes to the implications for the delays in tracking evidence and in making conclusions, I mean, the implications are obvious. They are in the human toll, they are in the humanitarian exacerbation of the humanitarian crisis, but also in allowing the groups to consolidate even more. When the relationship is nascent and something could be done to stem it or to disrupt it, but governments and their partners keep downplaying it, what you tend to see is the groups now continuing to move and to consolidate that relationship. And at the end of the day, by the time you wake up to the link has already become too strong to be disrupted. And therefore, it's like, a small problem that has grown bigger. That's what we have seen in the Lake Chad region. That's certainly what we have been seeing in the Sahel. And I think there is need for policymakers to, like I said, invest more in research, but also understand that in studying secretive organizations like the one we study, you hardly can get direct evidence, but your information of the broader context and of other contexts which might be similar is important in drawing your conclusion, because it is always better to err on the side of caution, to presume that the relationship exists when you have the evidence, and then work on that. Because if you don't expect the worst to get the best, then you might end up expecting the best but getting the worst. And I think that's what we have seen in most of the context. So you would see groups getting more sophisticated and lethal, civilian groups, civilian population decimated, humanitarian crisis exacerbated before we wake up to see that, oh, there was this relationship and we could have done something initially to disrupt it. I think it's still not too late for Congo. Of course, we can see the relationship already getting stronger, but I think it's not too late.
Jason, I mean, could you speak a little more about your concerns, particularly regarding, I guess, the implications of an ISIS link to the ADF? And I mean, I guess part of the issue is the way in which people will interpret this, and from that interpretation, kind of draw out what they believe the solution should be. So I think we probably need to unpack some of the relationships there. But I want to give you the opportunity to speak more about those concerns, because I suspect that we all, if not complete, but certainly in part, would agree with a lot of them.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's a complex issue. I think it comes in various different components. So seeing this, there is a tendency by some people in the Congo, but also in the Defense Department in the United States and others, to really put an emphasis on understanding the ADF as a terrorist organization, as an affiliate of ISIS. And from that, a lot of policy decisions are then made in terms of, in general, how to treat the Congolese government. I mean, the US is now providing military support to the Congolese government. It's very, very modest. It's mostly training. But also how it engages with the Congolese. The Congolese government, I can tell you, is, and I have this from the highest levels of government, really does believe that by presenting this as a terrorist organization, that a lot of their problems are going to be solved, right? In other words, they're going to get the backing of the new US government. And then by all of the problems going to be solved, I think they mean what's happening in Beni, that it will allow them to track finance, that it could get them military support. But I also think that they believe it's going to provide them with a certain amount of political capital. I mean, we've seen Museveni do this with regards to Somalia. I mean, Museveni is now deep into, let's see, he came to power in '86. And so, you know, he is now, what is that, 35 years in power. And there hasn't been a lot of pushback from places like in the US government, in part because he plays such a crucial role in Amazon, right? And so I think that's a very good example of how you can really gain a lot of political capital by participating in counterterrorism operations that align with US government interests. And I think that, so that's an example of how things could shake out. Now, I'm not saying we're there yet. And obviously the US government includes many people who have a much more nuanced understanding of the situation, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I think that's just an example of how things could go in that direction. I think in particular, my concern is that the ADF in the Eastern DRC is a strong group, but it's a group that has very few anchors in the Eastern DRC. I think this is important, and it's a huge difference from Boko Haram, even from what's happening in Mozambique, in the sense that the Muslim population in the Eastern DRC is marginal. I think 3%, perhaps 4% in the Eastern DRC, very, very small part of the population. Now, 3% is still 3%, and you can still recruit in that 3%. And there are, I believe, Congolese who have joined also for ideological or religious reasons. But that's, I think, a distinction to be made. The other thing I would point out is that in terms of the ISIS, I mean, ADF is not strong in terms of having a local base. And it's also not strong just in terms of military strength, I think. Now, this is misleading, obviously. Obviously, they're strong. They've been able to do what they've been doing and escalate their violence and still not be eliminated. But I think as much it is an example of the strength of the ADF, it's an example of the weakness of the Congolese state and the Congolese government. And so I think that, in 2014, the Congolese government launched a large offensive. It almost crushed the ADF. It came to the verge of crushing the ADF, showing that they have this capacity. And since then, for various reasons, that offensive eventually faltered and failed. But that's why the former leader of the ADF, Jamin Mukulu, had to flee. That's how Baluku came to become the current commander of the ADF. And so it had a real transformational, and it could have, I think the ADF at that point were estimated to be a few hundred, so dramatically smaller than they are at the moment. And so the Congolese government has the capacity. I think the question is, why aren't they using this capacity more? And that's a complicated question. And one of the questions is accountability. And so I think whatever we do in terms of how we treat the ADF, we do so in a way that reinforces Congolese government's accountability to be able to treat not only the military dimension, but to treat the other dimensions as well, to make sure that issues of customary succession and land conflict and local administration are dealt with as well. So I think that, these are issues that are dealt with and that come up in counterinsurgency operations everywhere in the world. But I think it is important to highlight these tensions that one sees between the military approach, and I understand we're all on the same page in that regard. But it is important to highlight, because once if all you have a hammer, everything's a nail. If all you see is a radical extremist military organization, then I think one of the national inclinations is to kick this out to the Defense Department. I'm just being facetious, but is to take a military approach to this solution. I think that would be a mistake.
Look, Laren, it's interesting that as we're having this discussion here and reflecting on some of these analytical points, how there is this recurring misunderstanding about the Islamic State, what the Islamic State actually provides to its affiliates. I know this has been highlighted by some of the other speakers, but this idea that, well, all the Islamic State actually really offers is just violence and more violence. And we've seen other reports that have come out that have said, oh, well, it can't be the Islamic State because, look, they're not They don't look like Mosul. They don't look like Raqqa. They don't have IEDs. So it's one of these things where there are these misunderstandings that then get transposed onto a local affiliate, and you have a ripple effect of misunderstandings that end up informing some of these assessments. And I think that what's been fascinating about this panel and about all the discussions that we've had and the kind of exchanges that we've seen in publications over the past, well, certainly for the past year or so, is this interplay of different kind of perspectives. I'm kind of hoping that perhaps you'd be able to kind of bring together, I guess, your perspectives on the way in which some of this can be overcome, the way that I try to move this, that we can move this forward, acknowledging that there is evidence of this link, but at the same time doing it in a way that's going to be proportional and not distract in a way that I think many people are concerned will happen, or it'll take us down a path where the result will be much worse.
Yeah, I think there's often the issue becomes polarized, or the ADF is looked as binary. It's either a local armed group that has illicit ties, or it's an Islamic affiliate. And the ADF existed before the Islamic State. We have it on good account that Musa was commended for his years in jihad before, when he made his pledge to ISIS, to al-Baghdadi, that he was essentially exalted because he had been in it since the mid-90s. And so the ADF has been a part of the landscape in Eastern Congo for a lot longer than Islamic State's been around. And so essentially they've been rehatted. And so there's been great scholarship done about its connections to the local businesses and its illicit, its extraction of resources, specifically timber. And these things still do exist. And yet on the same hand, we are finding we're finding evidence of foreign financing that seems to be, as one fighter told me in Beni last month, Musa would call everyone together and say, IS has sent us another tranche of money. And so, and it seems that they're relying on that external financing. And so when we look at some of the reactionary, the counterterrorism policies of, yes, we have similar concerns that, issue or counterterrorism policies used otherwhere would not fit in this ecosystem. And Eastern Congo is already heavily militarized. Jason talked about the Congolese military, but you have one of the largest, offensive UN fighting forces up there, made up of African armies in itself. So it's a very heavy militarized response to the ADF already, and the humanitarian situation is dire. And so I think there's a lot that can be done outside of the military response. But I think what we need to do is I'm very curious personally, because the ADF is kind of rewriting its own narrative and its own doctrine and it's kind of its own history now, by that video Tara showed about Musa Buluku talking about the ADF is no more, that was a alliance of convenience, and we've always kind of been this way, and now we're moving on. And my kind of questions are, okay, what is the real makeup now of the ADF? If it's a regional fighting force, we've heard stories of Tanzanians and Burundians being treated better than the Ugandan fighters, that Congolese fighters are often not even used anymore in battle because they escape. And so these kind of dimensions need to be studied more in order to develop these non-connect responses, specifically for defection, disarmament. And in addition to that, to investigate so that's at the local level, at the tactical level, if you will, and at the strategic level, there's been documented cases of Mozambique fighters coming to the ADF. I debriefed one, and they're from Cabo Delgado, just kind of in 2017, when the kind of, I guess, the nascent concerns about what's going on down there was being raised by the local population, that there was this armed jihadist group. And so those links, because of geographically and because ADF and ISIS and MOS are geographically linked in the province, it seems more natural that that they could actually have some kind of operational or financial cooperation. They're obviously both pulling from the same recruitment pot in Tanzania and Burundi. They're both going after that. So is there going to be competition for resources? Is there going to be cooperation? You know, is Mozambique going to be where ISIS fights on the battlefield and ADF is trains people to send down there? Because as Jason said, it's going to be very difficult for ISIS if they're looking, we talk a lot about the difference between IS and Al-Qaeda. Is Islamic State wants to hold territory. It's a state. It sees itself as this sovereign state. And so that's going to be very difficult for ADF in Congo to do. It's pushing north into Ituri, but it's not going to find sympathy among the local population. And so it's going to have to continue to expand its capacity for violence to push people away if it wants to grow its holdings, or it's going to have to come to terms with the fact of what it is inside of ISCAP, its role to play.
Well, that's a great response. You probably answered 2 or 3 of the questions that we've had coming in, but we have many, many more. And so I think I'm going to get into the audience questions now. The first is regarding the ADF leadership. Perhaps, Tara, you could take this one. How are you assessing the ideological leanings of ADF leadership, as well as lower into the fighting ranks? Is there a clear divide between the foreign fighters brought in through IS connections and the local fighters? I know Laren kind of hinted at some of that, but interested in a bit more.
Sure. So as I mentioned, Buluku is much more ideologically extreme than we saw from Makulu, from Jamil, from the former leader. And he is, from what we can tell, he is largely imposed this in the beginning on the group. There were people who took Jamil's side who didn't want to align with the Islamic State. It actually caused a split in the group. A small portion of the group split off and has continued to be aligned with Jamil and has refused the alliance with the Islamic State. But it is very small. There's only one high-ranking ADF member that we know of that split off. A couple of Jamil's children were killed because Buluku had them killed because they refused to support the alliance. But other than that, the majority of the ADF leadership has gone lockstep with Buluku into this alliance. There are some unsubstantiated rumors that, maybe they're not all fully on board, but there hasn't been any real evidence of that, any real evidence that anyone is trying to, walk the group away in any way. So at least at the leadership level, we see a fairly uniform acceptance of this. When you get down into the rank and file, there are some divisions. The majority of people are, at this point, at least aware of the alliance. In the beginning, that wasn't so, but now it is, widely discussed, widely known that they are ISIS in Congo, and it is very much a propaganda machine within the ADF. There are, daily lectures. There are, it's drilled into people that they are part of this Muslim Brotherhood. The extent to which that's believed by the rank and file, it's hard to tell. Like Larry said, we are seeing more and more people who are joining for apparently ideological reasons, who are being recruited in their local mosques and going to Congo to fight jihad. But what that breakdown looks like, I don't think we have a good estimate at this point. There are still people who are being tricked in, who are being forced in, who don't want to be there. So I would say that the rank and file is probably split between those who are actually ideologically aligned and those who are they happen to be in the group.
think that actually transitions really well to there's actually a lot of questions for Bilama, following up on some of your comments there. A lot of interest from our audience about, I guess, for want of a better term, kind of the Pan-African, I guess, potential here. The possibility of these different affiliates developing relationships between them that go beyond the symbolic and potentially strategic and operational, and I guess what that would mean in terms of the broader, I guess, regional stability, but particularly the flows of foreign fighters. So yeah, interested in, I guess, firstly that potential for those Pan-African kind of connections being made, and then those implications for foreign fighters.
Yeah, so when it comes to the development of operational relationships between groups or amongst groups in Africa, we have seen examples of those in theaters like the Sahel, where you saw 4 different Al-Qaeda affiliates coming together in 2017 and merging and forming the Jamaatul Nusratul Islam wal Muslimin that is now called JNIM. And these 4 groups have always been operating in slightly different geographies, but in the Sahel, that then came together to form this group. And we saw an upsurge in attack and better coordination between the groups once that happened. But that's something that happened in a particular geography. And the point I was making is the need for research into these groups' aspirations, what they might be doing beneath the ground around developing professional operational links. One thing, for example, that I am looking into, I have been researching into, is the possibility of northwestern Nigeria becoming a land bridge between the Sahel and the Lake Chad region. And that's particularly an area of interest for me because we have seen in the last 2-3 years continued effort by jihadi groups in the Lake Chad to infiltrate the northwestern part of Nigeria. And we know that the northwestern part of Nigeria can link up to the Sahel. And we know that the borders are very porous and all that. So those kinds of relationships, but also even in this Central African landscape, we know that there is a group that is now active in Mozambique, a group that is active in Congo. And the research uncovers some evidence of Mozambican fighters fighting in Congo. Is that an indication of something that could become operational? Of course, I am conscious of the fact that these groups are, there is a barrier between them in terms of where they are operating geographically, but I think we better be proactive. Look at areas that could be porous. We know that especially they like forests, and if areas are connected by forest or mountains, they can easily infiltrate those areas and develop an operational route there, whether in terms of fighting together or just arms, smuggling arms and loots and all that stuff. And I think, not that I have any watertight evidence around that except the ones I have just spoken about, but I think I strongly feel there is need for more investment into those kinds of proactive researches to look at possible scenario and how to prevent them from emerging.
A quick follow-up. To what extent have foreign fighters in your particular focus areas around that Lake Chad, to what extent have foreigners been able to move up the ranks, or is this a case of senior leadership being dominated by locals, or a tendency towards senior leadership being dominated by locals as we see in other areas?
Yeah, I mean, senior leadership is almost always dominated by locals. But locals in the Lake Chad region, for example, means someone from either Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, or Chad. So it's 4 countries that are sitting on the same border, and that's where Boko Haram operates. Even in the Sahel, when you say local, that local could be from Burkina Faso, it could be from Mali or Niger. But what we have not seen in either in the Lake Chad region is for example, someone coming from Algeria or from Mauritania and becoming a leader in the Lake Chad region. But we have seen some evidence of that in the Sahel, even though you can't say the groups exclusively operate in the Sahel, but even the current leader of Jenim or Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, after the former leader was killed 3-4 months ago, is an Algerian. And so in that kind of situation, you could say a non-local, a foreigner, is coming to become a leader for Lake Chad groups, but sorry, for Sahel groups. And we know that that particular leader is from Algeria, but is resident in the Sahel. And I think around the question of ideological commitment to groups, we would always be better off to divide groups membership and leadership into different typologies, into different groups, because what we see in most of the research is the higher people are in the spectrum of leadership, the more ideologically committed they are likely to be. And so just because you have foot soldiers who are fighting for money or for other consideration like grievances, does not mean the group is not ideological. I think it's very important to understand their leaders' messaging and what the group claims to be.
Thank you. We've got a lot of, the discussion has clearly sparked a lot of interest in the Congo more broadly. So Jason, actually, we've got quite a few questions coming in about, I guess, access to Congo data and reports. And obviously, you have a senior role at the Congo Research Group. So perhaps could you speak a little bit about the Congo Research Group and for those who are interested, we're certainly interested to learn more about the work that's being done there.
So for people looking for data on the violence, I can plug our own organization here, the Kivu Security Tracker, that is the most comprehensive tracking of violence in the Eastern Congo more broadly. It is currently in the 2 provinces, so North Kivu and South Kivu, which includes the area around Beni where the ADF is most active. It will soon include Ituri province, into which I think as of April, we'll begin publishing data from Ituri province as well. And so it's all geolocated and mapped out on the website, kivusecurity.org. That's a good place to go to. ACLED is, ACLED.org is another website for violence around Africa. They have, I think, less data on the DRC than we do, but they're a great website. They also do great reporting in terms of violence in Mozambique and in the Sahel as well. And so that's an area. But in terms of understanding, and I would really emphasize this, that data on violence are really just little dots on a map or numbers on a page if you don't contextualize them and understand the history and politics out of which they're born. And so we've published 3 reports now on violence around Beni, 2016, 2017, and then last year. And that includes a lot of contextual information on how to understand this. And our website, which is congoresearchgroup.org, includes a lot of other reporting in terms of Congolese politics and violence as well. So those are some starting points.
Great, thanks, Jason. Digging into the Congo a bit further, I'll just turn to Larry. We have a question here. Do you feel that the recent division of the ADF into 3 distinct elements operating in and around Beni, northern, southern, and central operational groups, do you see that as simply a strategic tactical choice for the group, or is it, does it kind of suggest potential factional splintering?
Historically, ADF has always had these 3 areas of operation, rather than look at them like different groups, because the commanders go up and down. They traverse these areas. So you have Butembo or Molikwa Isole, as they call it, which is south of the Beni Kasindi Road, which is the main thoroughfare there. That's where new fighters come. And when we say new fighters, I mean from Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, these areas, and they're brought down to camps down there where they are trained. And you don't see a lot of violence down there against the local civilian population. There's almost this tact understanding that the ADF is going to be quiet down there. They oftentimes have a under the table deal with the local population that we exist and we are going to be training, and we'll take a small percentage of your field's yield in order to leave you alone. Then these fighters are then transited up north. So it's this, what we call the Beni Kasindi triangle, where Beni to Erengeti and Kamongo triangle, which is the kind of main historical operational part. And that's where the leadership operates. And you see a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of the civilian violence in that area. And that's where a lot of the heavy militarization is. And then recently, as of 2020, in earnest, we see the ADF setting up bases north into Ituri. And they've used this historically in the past as areas where they move their sick or wounded during Congolese military offenses. They've moved them to Ituri, but it seems like they've shifted into, they have permanent bases up there, operational bases. IS Central in the last few weeks has been releasing high resolution stills of the ADF overrunning towns, which is something very new. To kind of go back to your point, is in this evolution of the ADF, is that last year we saw the ADF attack a major prison in Beni and release a large amount of the fighters. About 300 or so were ADF, and then the other 1,000 or 900 or so were part of various criminality, local militias. But what's really interesting is that a lot of people who have come back from that prison break have talked about that there was that essentially there was this well, one, the group was holding the banner Muhammad. There's videos released after where these prisoners were made to pledge allegiance to IS. But what was also interesting is that there was a lot of coordination, according to, if you believe defectors, between the ADF and IS Central about this leading up to the prison break. So that, because the prison break happened, there was a global call by IS to break the chains, which ADF answered on the day with the attack. And so it showed this kind of communication link between ADF and Central IS to participate in this global campaign, which is a very, very outside of the norm of what we've seen.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that now with about 10 minutes to go, perhaps we can start to address a more simpler question, which is solutions. How can we kind of solve some of these issues and even begin to understand potential solutions here? I guess we need a question that has come up a couple of times is, I guess the flip side of the question that I'd kind of begun this this discussion with, which is what are the risks of designation? What are the risks that are associated with the State Department's designation? Does it give more legitimacy to this ADF faction than they actually deserve? I'd open that up to anyone and everyone. Tara?
Sure, yeah, I can start that off. You know, like Jason has said, that's something that we are very aware of, and we weigh in our research in trying to, well, in publishing this information and also trying to determine how strong this link is. Like Larry has said, we're not coming out and advocating any sort of military response because of this link. What our worry is that a failure to recognize it is a failure to recognize opportunities to counter the group's violence. Specifically, as we've said, in the finance and in the recruitment area, that these present non-military opportunities that you can really reduce the ADF's capacity. And so that's where our focus is moving forward, is on trying to find where the ADF where the Islamic State and the ADF, where that alliance is leading them, where that looks, especially internationally, where we can bring in additional non-military help, and really working on that side of things to try to counter the group.
There's clearly a humanitarian crisis. There seems to be kind of a perpetual humanitarian crisis in this area. And so, and there's obviously issues of access as well. In terms of humanitarian responses in this particular region, I mean, Jason, can you reflect on what has been successful in that regard, and what perhaps what lessons can be learned more broadly? And I think that now is probably a good time for us to move almost beyond the ISIS question, and in terms of, well, how can the broader security and humanitarian situation in this area be kind of understood?
Yeah, just briefly on the previous question, I think it is important to highlight, for me, the largest risk in terms of the designation, in terms of the framing of ADF as a terrorist organization and ISIS affiliate, again, without contesting necessarily that all those things are the case, is that this is ISIS in general, and ADF as well, they thrive off propaganda, and you don't want to do their work for them. And so by designating them as a terrorist organization, you, to a certain extent, are spreading the word. You know, and so the question is, as you pointed out, I think in your question, Haroro, is to what extent do you want to legitimize a group more than they deserve to be legitimized? So that I think is a real and serious threat, especially for the neighboring countries. Again, the people who I think are most likely to join the ADF are not Congolese, but disaffected Tanzanians, Kenyans, Ugandans, Burundians, Rwandans, and so the degree to which that we or one is spreading the message by designating them as a terrorist, I think that is something to consider. And I don't know, I forgot your question. Sorry, could you repeat your question again?
So I know it was just about the potential for humanitarian effort more broadly. Like we can move away from this, from the ADF specifically, but just the humanitarian crisis there. I'm interested in your reflections on.
Well, I mean, those humanitarian organizations are very good at providing food and non-food items to displaced people, which is what they do, and to intervene in health. The problem is that doesn't alleviate the fact that they alleviate the displacement. It's a Band-Aid. They're very aware, aid workers are very aware that it's a Band-Aid. I don't think the problem in the Eastern, of course, there's problems in terms of humanitarian access and in terms of funding levels, which are, I believe, only at a third of what they're supposed to be. All of these things are a huge problem. But the main problem is that you still have this vast crisis of violence. And if you look at the ADF is one of 120 roughly armed groups that we've documented currently active in the Eastern Congo. They are one of the most important ones, but they're only one of 120. Most of the 5.5 million people displaced are not displaced by the ADF, they're displaced by other groups. And so for me, if you look through this mess of armed groups and these extremely complex layers of driving conflict, the best access, the best entry into solving this crisis is through the Congolese state. In fact, I can't imagine any approach to solving this crisis that would not go through the Congolese state. You can build up the private sector, you can have local reconciliation programs, you can provide humanitarian, you can do development projects. None of those things would fundamentally, I think, unravel the crisis of governance that is, I believe, at the core of what's going on at the moment in the Eastern DRC. And so, it's of course a much longer conversation in terms of understanding what the drivers are. But I think the real, to answer your question, nothing has worked so far. Otherwise, we wouldn't be. And there are more people displaced today in the Congo than at any previous point in Congolese history ever. And if something had worked, we would not be there. And in order to get out of there, I think you need to have a real strategy, which is currently lacking both within, to be frank, foreign donors, the UN peacekeeping mission, as well as within the Congolese government. There is no plan to solve either the ADF or the other armed groups in the Eastern Congo other than military operations. And those military operations have patently not worked. They're now discussing a demobilization program, and I believe one will probably start for Congolese combatants. But again, a demobilization program is part of a broader strategy, or needs to be part of a broader strategy. There is no broader strategy. And I think that is the starting point of where the conversation needs to go.
Thanks, Jason. Bilal, I guess it'd be great to get your reflections, I guess, on some of the lessons learned in terms of developing solutions, you know, and I guess the evolution in how we think about these issues and how that then kind of, I guess, trickles down, hopefully, eventually, into the strategies that we develop. Are there any lessons learned that perhaps you can draw out of your research and experience that may be applicable here?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. The first point I want to make is around the designation question. There are obviously risks, and I think every human decision has risks. So for me, the most important thing is for us to leverage the designation and make sure that the benefits it comes with are realized. And part of it is this point you raised in the research, which I would have wanted the research to go deeper into, around the ADF's networks in London. And possibly there could be other networks around Europe. And I raised this with designation because I remember that in the case of Al-Shabaab, Al-Shabaab was designated, was proscribed by the UK about 2 or even more years after they have been designated by the US. And what that allowed Al-Shabaab to do is to continue to recruit and raise finances in Europe and other places where they have not been proscribed. And I think, so the obvious point, especially with the report mentioning networks in London, is for the UK government to closely study the evidence from the State Department and from this report, and to move fast and proscribe this group so that their financial network can be disrupted before it is too late or before they raise even more money. Now, when it comes to lessons learned, I completely agree with the points Jason raised around humanitarian aids. And unfortunately, the picture he painted of more people displaced in Congo than ever in the history of the country, in Eastern Congo, I should say, is almost the case in other places in Africa. In Nigeria, there are now 9 million people in dear humanitarian need, according to the UN yesterday. In the Sahel, there are more and more people getting displaced. And I think that goes to the point that aid can help in ameliorating the situation, but it cannot solve the problem. It is not a solution. And the solution is investment. And when I say investment, I am talking about investing into some of the areas. Part of what is exacerbating this problem is Africa, is this continuous weakness in the social contract, because governments are ineffective. And so investing in governments, building government's capacity to be more effective, to strengthen the social contract, investing in education, investing in economic opportunities for young people will help, but also investing in counter messaging around the ideological narratives that are exploited by these groups. And I think the last point I would mention when it comes to developing situations like Congo, Mozambique, and others is for security forces to do no harm. We know that the military response is necessary, especially to contain groups that are inflicting violence on innocent civilians. But we have seen in the Lake Chad region, we have seen in the Sahel, how efforts by security forces, human rights abuses by security forces, and we have started seeing evidence of that in Central Africa, have pushed even more young people to extremist groups, some of them to take revenge, some of them just because they have been maltreated by security forces. And so corruption and impunity must be watched. We must stop them if we want these problems to be ameliorated. So security forces should do no harm, should make sure they comply with human rights laws and regulations in their response to these groups. Maybe I will stop here.
That's great. Laren, the final question for today. I think we might kind of end it actually on a note that Balama brought up about the UK links. This is obviously a really important part of the report. I think it's a revelation that some people will be quite surprised about. Perhaps we could conclude with some of your insights into that.
Yeah, I mean, the group has had a historical, even predates IS, UK links. Jamil Makulu, the founder, resided there, and there's been British citizens arrested both in Congo, Tanzania, and Uganda, trying to transit to the group or supporting the group. According to our research and debriefing, there's still British citizens inside of this group, and individuals purportedly still in some fashion either financing or staying in contact with the ADF and Musa Baluka's group. And so there's an opportunity to use these sanctions to investigate that and hopefully prosecute individuals who are supporting this terrorism in Congo. I will say that's, you know, it's been a historical link. It's a smaller cell that we see amongst the global support, and so we don't try to make it is out to be central to their survival. But nonetheless, as a Western country that often tells people that they should not harbor terrorism, I think it's very important that we live up to that expectation and follow through when that's happening in our own soil. And then just the final thought is that as Congo is working hopefully out this broader plan, as Jason pointed to, and going through the Congolese state, I think the sanctions and hopefully some of this research and hopefully follow-on research works on developing a regional strategy to ISIS and DRC. I think so many of these issues are oftentimes strategies crafted within a embassy or within the geography context of, you know, just Congo or just Tanzania, but the ADF is truly a regional force now, and they talk about their operational brothers in Mozambique, and if they were in need, that the brothers would come and join and help them fight them. And so I think we need to start to predict and to develop policies and responses that are regional in nature too, on top of developing the local response.
Fantastic. What a great note to end today's panel. I really do want to thank our panelists today, Tara, Laren, Balama, and Jason. Really fantastic insights into a really, really troubling kind of topic. And please, everyone listening in, when you get a chance, do have a look at the Islamic State in the Congo report, which was released just a few days ago. So thank you again for your time, and yeah, until next time. Thank you.